Hi guys, welcome back to Kingdom Come Deliverance for what will probably be the penultimate reading video of this game. In the first video we did the general section, in the last one the characters. Today we'll be reading the society section, and then in the next and last video we'll read the locations and the events, because those are by far the shortest. As you can see, I'm missing quite a few entries again. 7 to be precise. Again, I'm not sure how I could have missed so many, because I played through the whole game and I assume it would have been obvious which ones I missed, but yeah, we'll have to make do. So, starting with the Armoursmith. The medieval Armoursmith fashioned armor from metal plates or sheets, the cuirass, various pieces for the legs and arms, helmets and gauntlets. Specialists in chainmail armor were called berniers, and an ironclad would need both types of armor. The chainmail went underneath, the plate armor on top. Common soldier would have only partial armor, the breastplate, helmet and gauntlets. A complete suit of armor was beyond his means. Ornate or tailor-made armor was the prerogative of the rich nobility. Plate armoursmiths were assisted by polishers who polished or buffed up the armor. Then the baths and bathmaids. Where hygiene and bathing was not up to scratch, the public baths were on the rise. Public baths in Central Europe appeared from about the 12th century. There were baths quite literally in every town, and not in small numbers. Sometimes a town would have 3 to 4 bathhouses. Here, people had access to hot water for bathing or steam baths. In those times, steam was produced by pouring water onto heated bars of iron or stones. Bodily cleanliness was in the care of male and female bath assistants. Fully body washing was done in bathtubs, coopered, wooden vats and tanks. In Bohemia, there were baths in operation since the early Middle Ages, and their numbers rose steadily. There were 47 public baths in Prague in the second half of the 14th century, and by the 15th century the baths were attended not just by the well-to-do, but also by the poorer classes. There was even a regulation that the bathkeepers had to open their doors once a quarter to the poor and to students. Bathhouses typically belonged to the municipality and were leased to the bathkeepers. In addition to municipal and private baths, there were also private baths in the houses of the nobility and wealthy townspeople. In the 13th and 14th century, the bathhouses were very much associated with prostitution. In the 13th century, particularly, bathhouse prostitution became widespread, and there were scarcely any that did not provide sexual services. In the richer urban baths, there would also be pharmacists, massage therapists, stokers, and cleaners. In the villages, the bathhouse keeper had to do all these jobs himself. Hopefully not the prostitution part. Then we have beekeeping. During the Middle Ages, beekeeping was distinguished by how the honey was obtained, as either forest or domestic. The domestic beekeeper kept bees in hollow trees or in straw skeps, wickerwork hives, and were not subject to any regulation. Conversely, the forest beekeepers who kept bee colonies in the wild in hollowed-out trees formed a fellowship similar to a guild and paid a fee to the owners of the woodlands for every bee colony they took over. Beeswax was the main raw material for the production of candles, right until artificial wax or paraffin wax was invented. Honey was used as a sweetener and fermented to make mead. Next, beggar. Although beggars were on the margins of society, they had their indelible place in it. In the cities, there were hospitals earmarked for them, and the church also provided assistance. Begging was allowed at cemetery gates and in front of churches, and each beggar could occasionally go to the baths at municipal expense. Some monks were regulars among the beggars too, called almsmen or mendicants. The beggars were well known and tolerated in their communities, but by contrast it was believed that foreign and wandering beggars brought misfortune. There was seldom any shortage of alms, because charity and gifts to the poor were considered prerequisites for salvation. Next, blacksmith. Blacksmithing was one of the most important occupations since earliest times, because iron was a very valuable raw material. In earlier times it was not deep mined, but only acquired from surface mines. Not a piece was allowed to go to waste. People even kept used nails. There was a blacksmith in practically every castle, vicinity, or village, who forged almost everything that was needed for agriculture: knives, axes, sickles, plows, hoes, etc. Other blacksmiths specialized in making swords, helmets, lances, harness, fittings, locks, and jewelry. The forge was most often a shed with a wall. Its essential equipment consisted of large bellows, an anvil, tongs, hammers, punches, files, etc. In a well-equipped forge, the smith could develop a heat of up to 1400 degrees Celsius. Next is the butcher. The butcher's profession appears only in the 13th century, because prior to this, each townsman or villager could keep his own livestock and butcher the animals in his own yard. In later centuries, this led to conflicts with professional butchers, leading to the trade of meat being brought under statute with regard to guild rights. The main tasks of a butcher were to slaughter animals, carve up and portion them, and serve the meat outside of the town limits. Raw meat could not be transported inside the town, and domestic sale was severely punished. These measures were intended to prevent the spread of disease from old or badly processed meat. In time, the Butchers' Guild split into different specializations, such as those who worked only with lard and suet tallow butchers, small cut specialists, cured meat specialists, and those dealing in horns, hooves, and mucilage. I don't know. The butcher's craft also spawned tanners, saddlers, and cobblers. Next is the charcoal burner. With growing demand for processed iron, there grew a corresponding demand for charcoal, which could produce a temperature many times higher than unprocessed wood, much needed for the forging of steel weapons. The forges were supplied by charcoal burners, who spent most of the year living in the forest by their charcoal kilns, great piles of stacked wood covered in clay with just a few vents for air, where in an oxygen-starved atmosphere the wood slowly pyrolyzed to charcoal. Each pile would smolder and give off much smoke for several weeks, during which time it had to be delved through repeatedly. After it burned out completely, the yield of the process, charcoal, was unearthed from beneath the clay. The charcoal was then sold at a special market bearing that name, quite separate from traders in other goods. During the reign of Wenceslas IV, the charcoal burners already had numerous rights and freedoms regarding use of the forests, and were held in relatively high esteem. Resin was sold exclusively by wagoners and resin merchants, who themselves made pitch for greasing their wheels. The charcoal burners produced resin and pitch only as a sideline. The pitch merchants provided pitch to tanneries to impregnate leather and mixed it with tallow to grease the axles of wheels on wagons and carriages. Next is the executioner. As Limonka joins the party. The profession of executioner dates back to ancient Egypt and Rome, reappearing in Europe in the 13th century. Before this, capital punishment was meted by the judges themselves, or the prosecutors or relatives of the condemned, or other persons as suited. It was only with the advent of the executioner that all such tasks were under his remit. Although the executioner by his profession came into considerable money, and it was a status symbol for a town to have its own, the hangman or headsman would be a social outcast. For an honest citizen to make any contact with the executioner was to lose respect, and the executioner himself had to endure a lot of discriminatory measures. Sitting at a separate place in the church and at the inn, not taking part in social functions and celebrations, etc. The executioner took charge of punishments such as hanging, breaking knees, quartering, burning and torturing, drawing by horses, or beheading. He had his assistants, henchmen, who helped him with preparation and took away the bodies of the executed. Other tasks done by the executioner included the role of the knacker, who cleared away animal cadavers, caught stray dogs, and even sometimes just cleaned up filth from the streets. The executioner might also oversee the town brothel, was somewhat familiar with surgery, could set broken bones and dislocated limbs, or amputate them in case of gangrene. Sometimes the executioner sold articles directly related to an execution to the superstitious. For example, the hanging rope, the hanged man's fingers, or amulets made from his hair. Next is farmer. Medieval villages comprised some 90% of the populace, the majority occupied with agriculture and livestock farming. Even though farmers were freemen and had always owned their homesteads, the land beneath it was on lease from the monarch, or rather from the nobleman who had obtained it from the king in fiefdom. They would pay a portion of their annual earnings in rent, whether in cash, honey, wheat, or other crops. Sometimes they were also required to labor for the nobility, that is, to work unpaid on farmlands belonging to the liege lords. The territorial diets or councils of the 15th and 16th centuries decreed that the common country folk could not bear arms or engage in hunting. With special permission from the liege lords, they were allowed to hunt hares or small birds. Next is fisherman. Fishing was one of the most traditional ways of making a living. Fishing in running water had been done the same way for centuries. Only in the 13th century did monasteries begin to establish fish ponds, particularly for breeding carp. Fish was considered Lenten food, and given the frequency of religious holidays and fasting days, up to 1/3 of the days in the year, they became an essential part of the diet. The greatest boom in fisheries and fish farming in the Czech lands came in the 15th and 16th centuries. Fishing methods made use of various tools and traps, such as bones, wicker baskets, bottomless baskets, fishing line or rod with hook, and hemp nets with stone weights. All rivers belonged to the king and were leased to towns. Fishing was permitted only on prescribed days and hours. Some noblemen, despite this regulation, banned townspeople from fishing on pain of death. Nets were set by day because fishing at night was prohibited. Rod and line fishing was allowed even by those without a net fishing permit, since the catch rate of rod fishing was insignificant. Next is the grave digger. Not the one from Monster Truck. The grave digger took care of the graves and their surroundings, and the occupation was hereditary. The grave digger would live in a hut in the cemetery itself, next to the main entrance. He did his work not only in the village where he lived, but in the surrounding villages of the parish. Grave diggers were among the pariahs on the margins of society. The only member of the general populace who came into contact with them was the parish priest. Next, huntsman. Gamekeeping and hunting in the Middle Ages were not only for amusement, but chiefly a source of great profit for the king and the nobility who owned the woods. The feudal gamekeepers and huntsmen also undertook woodsmanship. In addition to their obligation to look after the game, they took charge of the forest and its protection. In the forests it was prohibited to hunt deer, fallow deer, boar, or any other game, violation of which was a criminal act subject to heavy fines, or even, in the case of repeated infringements, physical punishment. The same was true for unauthorized logging and collecting of timber. Many poachers came from the ranks of the poor and had not very much to lose, which quite often resulted in physical conflicts with the huntsmen when they were caught red-handed. Next is the locksmith. Even though we know of locking systems dating back to ancient times, locksmithing as a separate craft came into being roughly between 1390 and 1408. Before this time, the work was done by blacksmiths. In rural settlements, even after locksmithing came into its own, the work might well be done by an above-average blacksmith. In the 14th century, the lock was still fitted to the outside of the door, made of iron, and its mechanism was rather complicated. The locksmith decorated the lock cover and keyhole plates. People even regarded their fancy locks as a status symbol, until the locksmiths amalgamated into guilds, and their creativity began to be restricted by security regulations. Malters and Brewers. Beer had since the earliest times been brewed by anyone with the know-how. It was only in the 13th century that brewing gradually came to be regulated. The rules stated that beer could only be brewed and sold by a fully fledged citizen who owned a house within the town walls. The right to brew closely relates to the 1 mile right, which dictated that none but citizens of a town were allowed to conduct urban trades within a 1 mile radius of the city. The technical process was supervised by the master brewer. The making of the malt and beer was dealt with by the maltster, and the brewer handled the fermentation and brewing. In domestic breweries, all these jobs would be done by one man. The shelf life of beer depended on whether the finished brew was filtered or not. Yeast remained in the brew, as well as acetic or lactic bacteria contaminating it. Beer then, quite unlike today, resembled a thick mush and was very nutritious, hence known as liquid bread. It had to be drunk through a straw to filter out foreign matter. Saint Wenceslas was the patron saint of maltsters in Bohemia, with the legendary Gambrinus, though not a saint, was regarded as the patron of brewing. The Bohemian brewing tradition thrives to this day, and Czech beer is amongst the best in the world. Next we have the merchants. Merchants were of two types: settled or permanent, and traveling or occasional. The settled traders had permanent shops in towns and villages, while traveling merchants only brought their wares to the markets. Markets held once a week, and fairs held twice a year also offered wares by local shopkeepers, visitors and peddlers, or hawkers, street vendors without a fixed site. Shopkeepers had their permanent shops on the square. Merchants ran small shops and had the right to retail products they bought from artisans. Village folk got their supplies from neighboring craftspeople in the local tavern or from a merchant who brought supplies from larger townships. At the markets, goods from the village would be exchanged for goods produced and available in the town. The terms of trade were set by the ruler, for example, that only local merchants in sworn possession of freedom of the city rights could sell their goods freely. Only the traders from large cities would venture abroad. Many regulations and detailed rules governed trade. If it were found that a merchant was dishonest and, for example, gave short weight, he was severely punished. Next, millers. Milling is one of the oldest crafts in the Czech lands. The construction of water mills being well known since earliest times. Over the centuries, the mechanism was perfected, and in the Middle Ages there was a mill in practically every village. There were also windmills or mills powered by oxen or horses. Milling was one of the so-called freelance professions. They conducted trade in the village among other roles. With the increasing number of water mills and other water-powered equipment, there was a need to settle relationships between the various millers. Already by the mid-14th century, an association of provincial millers, experts in the field of water rights, was set up, with powers to survey water courses, stipulate the scale of mill earthworks, assess the technical condition of mills, and so on. They also drew up a code of conduct for millers, so as to ensure their use of water for milling caused no loss to others. Since the mills stood apart from the other village houses, millers were often the subject of gossip and were accused of earning money on the side in nefarious ways, from selling customers short on flour to outright witchcraft, thievery, and trafficking in stolen goods. The latter accusations in particular were certainly defamatory and without a grain of truth. Next, the mint master. Two officials in the medieval mint, whose job it was to oversee the quality of minted coins and punish counterfeiters. One of them was appointed by the king, and the role was hereditary. The second official was elected by the Bohemian nobility. Incompetent handling of the post or allowing flawed coins into circulation were subject to severe penalties, even the death sentence. Next, monks and monastic life. Every monastery, especially those in the Benedictine order, followed specific rules regarding allocation of time, activities, and possessions in the monastery hierarchy. In addition to worship, devotional reading, and copying or illuminating books, the monks labored physically. Depending on the time of year, they devoted between 6 and 8 hours to labor, 3.5 hours to prayer, and an equal time to study. The remainder of the day was allocated for rest and short sleep. Monasteries often had seminaries for monks and future priests, as well as medicinal workshops. The brother Infirmarius, the monk in charge of healing, worked not only in the monastery infirmary, but also helped outside the monastery, attending the sick or wounded in neighboring villages and towns. The day was divided by prayers, the liturgy of the hours consisting of 7 offices, beginning with matins, also called vigils, after midnight. The first choral prayers, lauds, were recited at dawn or between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., followed by prime at the time of the equinox at 6 a.m., terce, at 9 a.m., sext at noon, and none at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. An hour before sunset, the evening prayers, vespers, were said, and the daily cycle closed before bedtime, usually half an hour after sunset, with compline. It's a very long sentence. It's hard to keep track of what I'm actually reading. After morning mass, the community met in the chapter house and listened to readings selected from chapters of the rule, the order's book of precepts and regulations. Then there was a sermon and debate concerning the monastery. The brothers confessed their sins and were rebuked or rebuked others. Until midday prayers, they worked or studied. The rule primarily contained instructions concerning internal organization, emphasizing, for example, obedience, silence, temperance in speaking and eating, mercy, humility, and hospitality. The monasteries were closed from the outside. The monks of the Order of Saint Benedict especially were forbidden all contact with the outside world since the order's inception. They lived only in the cloister, the inner inaccessible heart of the monastery. They were not allowed to leave it, and neither could any layman enter there. Some spent their entire lives behind the monastery walls. Only entrusted elder monks and lay brothers communicated with the outside world. They took care of the entire running of the monastery outside the cloister. Then we have noble officials with a few sub-things. First, the hetman. Originally the commander in some armed forces, with a rank equivalent to captain. Later on, the role became that of a civic governor, selected from amongst the local nobility, who represented the monarch in a given territory. Then Hofmeister, from the German Hof, meaning a court or manor, a hereditary office at the royal court. He was responsible for management of the court. Then the Under-Chamberlain. Along with the Chancellor, the Under-Chamberlains, in Latin subcamerarius, was a member of the office represented the sovereign in the royal cities, such as proto-notaries or notaries. Strange sentence. And lastly, the Burgrave, the representative of the sovereign and representative of provincial officials of knightly status. His duties included management of the city and leading the army when needed. Then next we have the painter. During the early Middle Ages, no one knew the names of the artists who painted the panels and frescoes, and the bulk of their works remains anonymous to this day. Often the paintings were undertaken by monks, who decorated their monasteries alongside illuminating manuscripts. The painters and illuminators made their own pigments from ground natural materials. Their themes were mainly historical and biblical, or geometrically decorative. Next is the Pharmacist. The apothecary prepared medication according to carefully studied prescriptions that were passed down to generations. It was one of the few professions that was not organized into guilds. The production of medicaments was quite hard work and a great responsibility. The apothecary had to have studied at the university and would have schooled not only in Latin but also in Greek, had to be able to carefully measure out precise dosages of medications and to ensure the ingredients were always available. If there was no apothecary in town, there would be the monastery infirmary. And if that was not available, people turned to the services of herb women, lay herbalists, quack healers, or medicasters, called charlatans. Their methods of healing were controversial because in making lotions and potions, they made use not only of herbs, but of spells, amulets, and sometimes even very unusual raw materials, such as frog poison or hanged man's fingers. Next is the priest. The priests were among the elite in medieval society and among the few who had any education. Village priests were less educated than those of the larger parishes. They could barely read or write, had no library, and learned the liturgy by heart. They were none too well off, typically working in the fields or raising livestock, like lay farmers. They were not celibate, enjoyed folk entertainment and games, dancing and going to the tavern. As time went on, looser morals and educational decline spread to the towns and monasteries. By contrast, the priests in the larger parishes and towns owned more property, and with the exception of service to God, did not have to resort to any manual work. The duties of the priest encompassed preparation and serving of Mass, hearing confessions, taking care of the church, its operation and decoration, visiting the poor and the sick, arranging charity collections, collecting dues, conducting baptisms, weddings, last rites, and funerals. Next is prostitution. In Bohemia, the brothel was called a humbeis, whorehouse or house of shame, but not a brothel as such. Prostitutes were simply whores. The profession encompassed several categories. The most deprived prostitutes were homeless women who provided services in the streets. Others visited their customers in their homes disguised as bread sellers, yet others were available to noble and royal courts. Then were those who proffered their services in brothels of various price categories, whose clients were townsmen, officials, and nobles, or conversely, the most menial clientele in the most down-market establishments. Brothels were run not only by townspeople, but even by the spiritual leaders or prelates. For example, the parish priest of the Church of Saint Gilles under Vicherat, Often a brothel was directly connected to the bathhouse. During the Hussite Wars, many brothels were abolished, but boomed again soon afterwards. Their legalization was also helped by the Church of Rome, which considered prostitution a lesser evil than adultery. It speaks volumes that prostitutes accounted for almost 10% of the population of Papal Rome. There were numerous regulations and laws governing brothels, and the oldest profession, and even a special tax. There were even laws covering considerate treatments of prostitutes and protecting them from violence. Next is the Scribe. His main activity was to keep records of the territorial court and the meetings of the city council. He was one of the few in medieval society who knew how to read and write, making his services welcome in almost every city. Next, the Shepherd. A herder's job depended on the weather, most commonly starting in April and ending in the autumn. They took the entrusted herd or flock. It was rarely their own. More commonly, they were hired to supervise the grazing of others' livestock for a fee, from pasture to pasture, sleeping in rudimentary huts or shelters. Over the summer, they stayed out in the pastures, returning to the village when the first frost set in. Life far away from other people forced the herders to become adept at healing themselves and their animals, so when there was no apothecary to hand, folk would turn to the shepherd. Next, the Smuggler. In the Middle Ages, smuggling was regarded as taking any goods in or out of a town without paying export or import duties. Smugglers had to know alternate routes and how to avoid the tax collectors. When smuggling through gates, they made use of false-bottomed vehicles or baskets, or even resorted to climbing over the walls by night. Contraband included fabrics, spices, wine, and other less freely available goods, subject to high taxation. Next is the Stonemason. Stonemasons were engaged in the quarrying and dressing of stone. Their activities included quarrying stone blocks from the rock face, splitting them into smaller pieces, grinding, cutting, polishing, and dressing them to make building blocks or vault elements. The first mention of an organized stonemasons guild in Bohemia dates from the 14th century. The patron saints of quarries and stonemasons are Saint Roch and Saint Joseph, and in places also Saint Barbara and Saint Procopius. Stoneworking found application mainly in the construction industry. And a little sub-entry, Mason's Mark. The Mason's Mark was a graphic symbol, though not the maker's signature, on the surface of a finished stone piece. The number of finished and marked pieces determines the payment due. Each mason either attained his mark or had it allocated to him at a particular point in his apprenticeship, and then kept it for life. Next is Swordsmiths and Armourers. swordsmiths were originally blacksmith cutlers, specializing in blades for swords, knives, daggers, and other handheld sidearms. In the 14th century, the making of armor began to specialize and separate out from the blacksmith's craft. Specialist professions came into being: armorers, platesmiths, and bassoneteers, who not only produced but also sold their wares. As regards the weapons, there were new specialized professions: the swordsmith, bladesmith, fletcher, arrowsmith, and in later centuries the gunsmith, bowyer, or shieldsmith, making wooden and metal shields. The price of a complete suit of armor was very high, affordable only to wealthy noblemen. Those who could not afford a complete suit of armor would have only partial metal armor and would rely on their agility for protection in combat. Next, the tailor and draper. Until the 13th century, the tanners sold their wares for processing to suturers and cobblers. Cloth was made by weavers, but traded by drapers, who also often cut and sold it by the cubit, the length of the forearm. Only later, during the Middle Ages, did tailors sew cut pieces into garments. Simple garments were sewn by women themselves for their families. It was an issue to make sure the garments were well sewn, since they were inherited and would often last for decades, with minor repairs. By the beginning of the 14th century, people in larger cities were paying ever more heed to fashion. A tailor would begin to specialize in only one kind of garment. Hence we find coat makers, hosiers, hood makers, gantiers, hatters, and cape makers, and those who did alterations and repairs to old clothes. In a town the size of Rattay, the tailor had to turn his hand to general purpose work. Next is the tanner. The tanner was a craftsman who prepared and treated animal skins, after which he passed them on to cobblers, saddlers, or other craftsmen for making footwear, garments, bags, wine skins, etc. It was not a pleasant job, because the skin had to be quickly scraped of its fat and conserved to stop it going off, which was done by immersing in urine. In view of the unsavory smells produced by their trade, tanners settled on the outskirts of towns and belonged to the same reviled group as executioners, knackers, and prostitutes. To turn hide into a material for making shoes or clothing, after removal from the animal, it must first be thoroughly soaked in water. Once softened, it is fleshed, the residual gore and membranes are scraped off with a long, dull paring knife. In order to rid the hide of fur, it had to be soaked in lime water or rubbed with slaked lime, then scudded. It was then tanned using alum by a currier, with fish oil by a chamoisier, or with tannins dealt with by the tanner, from oak, beech, or other tree bark. During this whole lengthy process, the hide softened, was stopped from decomposing, and optionally turned a different color. At the end of the process, the hides were submerged for a few weeks in vats or pits full of urine. The leather thus produced was then dried and could be surface treated, painted or polished. Next is taverns, inns and innkeepers. The Czech word for tavern, hospoda, may originate from the Latin hospice, guest, hospitium, hospitality, shelter, though the more likely etymology is from the Old Slavonic gospod, gospodia, the master of the house. Ale houses were an integral part of all medieval villages. Originally, beer was drawn in what was called the Mass House, an area on the ground floor of a townhouse whose owner had brewing rights, while special purpose taverns and inns came along later. These served as places for social events, meetings, trading and lodgings. Some inns had rooms for overnight guests and special stables and spaces for carriages. These were called wagoners' inns and were located out of town at crossroads and along trade routes. The seating was more often outdoors than indoors. It was said of Wenceslas IV that he was fond of visiting taverns and alehouses to eavesdrop on what the locals had to say about him, and to check that the owners were complying with his edicts. In the Middle Ages, no one took exception to alcohol. The Germans, Russians, and Czechs in particular were Europe's fabled drinkers. There was a formal curfew at dusk, or when the night watchman began his rounds, although drinking and feasting often went on until the early morning hours. In KCD, we have tried to keep the image of medieval taverns faithful to surviving records. Okay, just 5 more entries. Next is the 3 orders of mankind. A notion of an ideal social order that was prevalent primarily in the 10th to 13th centuries. The basic principle of this system was that each person had a God-given place in the world that contributed to the welfare of mankind as a whole, thus ensuring universal unity and balance. The most extensive component of society consisted of those who worked, laboratores, whose purpose was to engage in crafts and cultivating the earth. Then came the fighters, bellatores, which originally comprised mostly the nobility and their retinues, whose task was to protect society and oversee compliance with worldly laws. Lastly, there were those who prayed, oratores, that is, the clergy, who were concerned with matters of faith and caring for the souls of the others to lead them to salvation. The formulation of the concept is most often credited to the French bishop Aldaberon of Laon. The concept of the 3 orders gradually became less convincing, to a large extent because it was not compatible with transition between the classes, while the development of cities in particular was accompanied by the emergence of relatively large, influential groups of burghers who did not fit into the original division of society. Next is the town garrison. Maintaining law and order in the medieval towns was the job of the bailiff. From the 14th century onwards, the function was taken over by the catchpole, then night watchmen and guards on towers. The catchpole, along with the bailiff, the executioner, and their henchmen, also carried out the punishment of transgressors. They were not, however, allowed to enter freehold dwellings, the palaces and houses of the nobility, the ruling class, nor church buildings or university, a fact students took advantage of. Order within the city also had to be upheld by the townsfolk themselves. They were obligated to report not only any crime, but just like the night watchman, to call out the hours and warn of fire, to call out the hours and warn of fire, flood, or tempest. For safety, it was forbidden to wander at night with an open flame, torch, or candle into any castles, chambers, stables, barns, or byres. Only lanterns could be used. To keep the peace at night, all taverns had to shut at sunset. In the medieval city, military service was entrusted to either hired professionals or the townspeople themselves. Every healthy adult male had to serve at least a few days a year in the civic guard, the city walls being divided and allocated in sections to each district or trade, and it was here that they mustered whenever an alarm was raised. In practice, the wealthy burghers bought their way out of serving in the militia, leaving other men to take their turn, and these poorer men welcomed the extra income, thus gradually forming a professional municipal gendarmerie. Each man had to procure the armor and weapons needed for serving in the guards and the militia, unless his guild did so. Only the rich cities could afford to have a public issue armory. The right to bear arms outside of duty was reserved for townsmen of sufficient means. Within the city walls, a simple melee weapon, dagger, or knife had to suffice. Only the really wealthy townsmen wore swords, taking after the nobility. Then we have Waldensians. The Waldensian movement first appeared in the second half of the 12th century in Lyon, France. Its founder was a wealthy Lyon merchant, Peter Waldo, also called Pierre Valdes, or Devoux, who gave up his worldly goods and returned to his former poor apostolic life. The main characteristics of the movement were voluntary poverty, strict interpretation of the scriptures, and, above all, criticism of the materialism of the church. They regarded relics of saints as mere human remains of uncertain origin, icons and sacred statues as objects of idolatry, and held that Mass said in a barn was as valid as any in a consecrated church. Waldo even translated the Holy Scripture into Arpitan, a French dialect of Provence, and preached using this translation. The movement, soon after its founding, gained a following in Provence, as well as in neighboring Lombardy. The sect was sometimes known as the Lyon Poor or Lombardy Poor. The emergence of the sect did not escape the watchful eye of the Vatican, and in 1179 Peter Waldo and his associates were invited to Rome to explain their opinions and actions before the Holy See and respond to theological questions. The outcome of this questioning is not clear, but the movement continued its activities and preached in ever greater opposition to the Roman Church until in 1184 the entire sect was excommunicated by the Synod of Verona and its members expelled from Lyon. Nevertheless, the Waldensians continued to endure thanks to its strict secrecy. Their communities were linked together by traveling preachers who visited the members' houses. The members of the sect were obliged to hide the preachers from pursuit, feed and house them, and ensure them safe passage to their next destination. Thus decentralized, the Waldensians persevered long after the death of their founder, sometime in the early 13th century, probably in what is today Germany. The Waldensians came to Bohemia primarily with German colonists, who undoubtedly were often fleeing persecution. But even in Bohemia, they did not escape systematic persecution, and by the end of the 15th century, the movement was suppressed throughout Europe, with the exception of the Cottian Alpine region between Piedmont and Provence, where they still maintained a compact community. At the end of the 1590s, the Waldensians joined the Genevan Reformation and became part of the Europe-wide Protestant movement. And the second to last entry, Winegrower. In Bohemia, wine growing began to spread from the 10th century onwards, due especially to liturgical reasons. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, vineyards were mainly for monasteries and the nobility, generally in similar places to where we find wine grown today, mainly in South Moravia. Due to the more favorable climatic conditions, vineyards could for a period thrive even in Bohemia, but later, after a global cooling period, they died off again. Taking care of vines kept vintners occupied all year round, the vintage harvest taking place from October to November, depending on the weather. Wine tended to be grown in places unsuitable for the cultivation of other plants, such as on rocky south-facing slopes. It could take 3 to 4 years to establish a vineyard, and it would be good for 30 to 40 years. The grapes were harvested and put into vats, where they were crushed by treading. White grapes were pressed immediately after crushing, and the juice kept in wooden barrels, tarred and sanitized with sulfur, where the wine was left to ferment. Red grapes were crushed, the seeds removed, and left to ferment in open vats, stirred regularly. This produced what is termed the mash, and after a few days this was pressed and the juice poured into barrels. King Charles IV was a great wine lover, who imported grapevines from France together with wine-growing know-how, and granted numerous privileges to vintners. And lastly, the woodcutter. During the early Middle Ages, agriculture and the rapid growth of towns took its toll on forests with massive clearing. There was no reforestation done in those days, so in the 15th century some areas had even less forest cover than today, while the towns themselves were surrounded by zones of outright devastation. Logging was done by woodcutters. Their basic tool was a large single-sided axe on a long handle or haft, while various wooden wedges and hammers were used to split the lumber. Transport of lumber from distant areas was difficult, which led to using navigable waterways down which the lumber was left to drift freely. Okay, that is going to be it for today. Took a bit longer than I thought it would, but still acceptable, I think. So next time we just have the locations, of which there aren't that many, and the events of which there are only a handful, so should also be more than doable in one video. I hope you found this somewhat entertaining, relaxing, interesting, informative, maybe. Thank you for watching and for listening, mostly for listening today, I assume, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.